everyone, this is Kelly, and I am here to do a little bit of an update or a little conversation about grief. This is something that I've talked a few times about on my channel, and I think I have a playlist with those videos, so if so, I will try to remember to put a link to that in the description box below. I think that my conversations about grief have engendered the most support and most kind and most loving comments, but they have also engendered some of the cruelest and harshest messages. And so that has definitely created an environment in which I am leery to have a conversation, to have this conversation. However, it is a conversation that's extremely important to me. And so I think that the show must go on, so to speak. So I have a lot of people that message me with questions about the grieving process because I do openly discuss it. I think it's an important topic to discuss. I think that if we live for any length of time on this earth, that grief is something that we will have to deal with. And so I think that it is an important topic, and it's not something that I will stop discussing. So I get a lot of messages with book requests, what books would I recommend for grieving process and these types of things. And so I just felt like it was kind of time to just do a little, this I know to be true. I think I don't know if there was a, PBS was there's something about this I know to be true. I don't know. That's been in my head a lot lately because I used to define a lot of things that I believed by what I didn't believe, and I've tried to sort of shift that thinking into what is it that I know I do believe, like this I know to be true. So maybe this will be the start of this I know about grief. So in terms of books, I'm going to hit that because I get that question a lot. I actually don't own or have read many books on grief because, to be honest, they irritated me. I tried reading some books on grief even before my son had passed, and I guess I should pause here for a moment because people do find your videos randomly based off of topic, not because they have been following your channel. So I will do a very brief recap. Again, I will put links below to other videos that I've gone into things in more detail, but I have a son who was born with a genetic disease that affected his bone marrow. We didn't know it at the time, and he was misdiagnosed until he was 18, but he had a very rare syndrome called Shwachman-Diamond syndrome, and I will put a link to the foundation below, which has more information about that, but we didn't know that until he was 18, and he passed when he was 23. So he was born very, very sick, and we were continually being given dates of when he was going to live until the first month. It was the first weekend, and then it was the first 2 weeks, and then it was the first month, and then it was the first year, and so on and so forth. Many, many hospital stays, many hip feeding tubes, oxygen, these types of things. So it was a very long, difficult medical existence, so to speak. And when he was 23, 4 years ago, in December, this past December would be 4 years, he passed away. And again, I have other videos in which I've kind of discussed that a little bit more thoroughly. So the point, I'm going to try not to dive too deep into to that aspect because I have other videos about that. But it was, of course, the most devastating thing that I have ever experienced. And And so, but this is my experience. I am not a grief counselor. I am not a therapist. I am not an expert on grief. I am an expert on my grief, my grieving process. And so everything that I discuss is coming from that viewpoint. And so for me, books I found to be extremely annoying because very often I found them to be a little bit too much of the cheerleader and the pom-poms. And in the midst of devastating grief, it was annoying to me. So I really don't have, which I try, I say this to people a lot when they ask for book recommendations. So I really don't have a lot of book recommendations. The only two that were personally very helpful to me, one isn't necessarily a book on how to grieve, but it was extremely powerful for me both leading up to my son's death and after. And it is a book by Phillip Simmons called Learning to Fall. And he was someone who was diagnosed with ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, which my uncle passed away from. Generally, you have a fairly short amount of time to live. I think he was given perhaps 5 years, and it's not, not that death is ever easy, but it's not an easy road to hoe. You lose function, gradually, and things are just taken away, but the mind remains sharp. And so it's a devastating disease. And he ended up living, I believe, for 9 or 10 years. So he lived much longer than expected, but it was, again, this long process of dying. So he was learning how to die over the course of 9 years. And so it's a small book. I highly recommend it just for anyone, just because it's a powerful book. There is a quote in that book, and I have been told by other people that it was a quote, perhaps he was quoting somebody else. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I heard this quote in reading his book, and it became a really foundational quote for me. So I'm going to do a lot of quite a few different reading things here. And so he wrote, "Don't talk to me about flowers and sunshine and waterfalls. This is the ground in which life sows the seeds of our fulfillment. The imperfect is our paradise. Let us pray then that we do not shun the struggle. May we attend with mindfulness, generosity, and compassion to all that is broken in our lives. May we live fully in each flawed and too human moment and thereby gain the victory." It's just, for me, it really hit home because it acknowledged that the victory isn't rising out of the flawed and imperfect moments, because for some of us that isn't possible, but the victory is gained in living fully and mindfully in those flawed and imperfect moments. And that greatly describes, for me, my experience of being Michael's mother for 23 years. So, and so that whole book for me is both a book on somebody learning to die, and also a book on learning to watch somebody or wait for somebody to die and or deal with somebody who has died. So it's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. Again, it is not a book on grief, but it's been very impactful to me. The only other book, I have a quote from a book, and I do want to talk about this because this is a quote of a book that really helped me in my grieving process, but I never read the book. So I read the foreword of the book, and this quote was in the foreword of the book, and it changed the way that I viewed my grieving process. And I don't know exactly how far in it would have been within the first year, perhaps near the end of the first year, after my son had passed. And the name of the book is When the Bow Breaks, Forever After the Death of a Son or a Daughter by Judith R. Bernstein. But this was a really big one because a lot of the grief terminology, when you get grief pamphlets or go to grieving websites or go to look at the backs of the books of books on grief. A lot of the terminology to me was very off-putting because it was this idea of recovering and sort of getting back to where things were before, and that simply wasn't, in my experience, that's something that simply wasn't happening or going to happen. And so I'm going to read this quote here because this really changed my grieving process. Along with overcome, the word recovery is often seen in association with grief. The premise of the current state is that grief, or any major trauma for that matter, is never overcome, nor does recovery take place. The course of healing involves integrating that trauma, not overcoming it. There is a significant difference. To overcome suggests that you get past or get over the trauma and go on from where you left off, but that is not what happens. No one goes on from any major event in their lives without having that event change them psychologically in some way. The process of integration involves changes in the person's view of the world, in the way they relate to others, in their values, in spiritual feelings, and so forth. It's the difference between stepping over an obstacle and being rerouted by it. And that quote really is what allowed me to, I think, make a lot of forward motion in terms of the grief, of learning to live with. That the point is not to recover. The point is that your life now has been rerouted, and the world that you live in looks very different. And the experience of living in the world minus the person that you are grieving is a different world. And so learning to live within this new world is what became the focus for me, less than trying to get back to any world that would recover a world from before, so to speak. So again, I can't recommend the book itself, although off of this quote, I would say maybe I need to go back and read it now. But I will say that quote became a very powerful one for me in understanding the grieving process, and became a basis actually for the reading that I do. I did first for myself, a 3-card reading, and one that I do for others. It's a kind of primarily how I support other people in the grieving process. So it's very key. The other book that I actually did read and did enjoy or gain from is actually a book called Grieving Mindfully. And it says A Compassionate and Spiritual Guide to Coping with Loss by Samit M. Kumar. And it's from a very mindfulness perspective. But there were definitely things in this that I found to be helpful. I think I actually purchased this prior to Michael's death because we had gone into palliative care for a few years prior to his passing. And I was thinking perhaps I could do some work on grieving, because when you're in palliative care, you're in that process of grieving. It's a very strange limbo space to be in. So I think I actually purchased this before Michael's passing, but I did find this to be very helpful. I know I think one of the main things that I gained from this book early on was that idea that grief is not linear. There isn't this idea that grieving starts here, your loved one passes away, or you lose them in some other traumatic way, because grief is not just about death. Grief can also be happen in divorce and in other traumatic events that occur. I apologize. She's not mindful of the grieving process. She's also an excellent healing tool. I think that one of the main things that I can remember gaining from this particular book was the understanding that grief is not linear, that it doesn't start here at the death of a loved one, and or whatever experience, traumatic experience that you might have gone through, and then process through these stages of grief, and then end up over here where you're recovered. That's kind of the mindset of a lot of the older books that I have looked at. That for a while there seemed to be a lot of conversation about those sort of stages of grief, and this happens, this happens, this happens, and you end up over here, and yeah, you're recovered. And that understanding, I think that this Grieving Mindfully kind of speaks to that idea. I think it was one of the takeaways I had from that, is that understanding that it isn't linear. I have certainly not found that to be the truth. But is a continuous, a cycle, as anything, as I think everything in life, it's this continual cycle. So as the Wheel of Fortune, you may be up, you may be down, you may be someplace over here, but it's not this this steady progression through a grieving process. So that's that. Between the Learning to Fall, which is not a book on grieving per se, and this Grieving Mindfully, these are the only two books that I have about grief. So I get questioned a lot about, what books would I recommend about grieving, and that's what I have. And everybody's different again, and that's one of the key points. Key points for me was, number one, what I read with the quote, the idea of not recovering but rerouting, that we are just simply learning to now live in a world that is very different, and we have to learn how to function and live in this world. And so taking away that term recovery was really key for me. So that was really important. And so I don't even know where I was going on that. So that was one of the key points for me, was this idea of recovery, not rerouting. Also that understanding that grief is not linear. And it's also very, very individual. Every single one of us, every person who deals with traumatic events or with grief in some way, loses somebody, the way that they are going to deal with grief is going to be very different. And that's why I'm very clear to say, this is my experience with grief. And that's the only thing that I'm an expert on, is my experience with grief. And it may look very different than somebody else's. And so there's no point in comparing grief processes, in my opinion. There are certain overarching themes, I think, that everybody experiences and can relate to, but everybody's grief is very individual. And so to know one person over here who went through a grieving situation, and then to have a new person over here that your friend loses somebody and their grief looks very different, and try to compare the two and say, well, this person's not as far along as this person was at this stage, or boy, they're kind of going off the deep end over here. Everybody is different. Everybody comes to grief with their own lenses, and with their own difficulties, and with their own their own personal baggage and their own personal ways of seeing the world that is going to affect the way in which they grieve. And a lot of times, one of the things that I've definitely learned is that you're not just grieving. So grieving doesn't just include grieving the loss of somebody, because it definitely does. Of course, that's a major component. But for some people, it's also very, and let me not say some people, let's keep it at me. For me, it was also very much a process of trying to figure out who I was, because my son was born when I was 21-ish. I'm bad at dates, but around 21. I was in a very naive and sheltered 21. My entire experience of becoming an adult, of figuring out what I believed in, my spiritual path, my growth path of who I was, everything that I was up until the moment of his death was influenced heavily by my experience of being Michael's mother, of being a mother of a chronically ill child, of being a mother of somebody who, was always having to deal with the idea of death from day one with. That experience as completely shaped who I was. And so for that to be then removed, to be then that portion, that chunk, that 23 years of molding who I was on a very internal level, to be gone and to be done, was devastating, not just in terms of the loss, which was, of course, there's no words for that, but was also devastating to trying to understand who I was. Like the idea of who I was not being actively being, I am Michael's mother, but not actively being his mother and doing the things that I did to be his mother was kind of mind-blowing, like to trying to figure that out, who I was. What do I do with a future that doesn't include all of those things? It was just mind-blowing. So the person very often is dealing with not just grief of the loss, but what are the other things also that they may or may not be dealing with, that can then change and shift and morph and make it look differently. So we're all individuals, we're all different people, and the way that we grieve is very different. So I think that was really important to learn, important to understand that there were many layers of things, and continue to be many layers of things that have to be processed and dealt with, that are along the side of, with the actual, just the simple, not simple, but the purity of just the loss of somebody. So that, I think, is why we have to understand everybody's grief is going to look differently. Ramble. I actually kind of kept a little bit of a list here so that I could try to stay a little bit on topic, but I'm not real good at that, as you'll know if you've watched very many of my videos. I also get a question. Somebody had messaged me a few weeks ago with I thought was that had lost somebody themselves, and one of the questions that they asked were they asked two questions. They asked what my greatest over the grieving process, what was my greatest fear and what was my greatest joy, or yeah, I think it was worded that way. I could be wrong in exactly the wording. And I really have been thinking about that. It was actually fairly quickly. It was an instant to the fear, was definitely my greatest fear has been, and it doesn't mean it has to be rational, right? Fears aren't often rational. But my greatest fear over the process is that he will be forgotten. That has become a very deep-seated fear of this wonderful, this like amazing human being, right? Here's Kelly gonna have to try not to cry. This amazing human being that I grew in my stomach. There's just no, my children, and that process of growing a human being inside of you, and then giving birth to them and growing them into adulthood. There's no greater thing that I can do. I mean, I can do amazing things and I can do great, but the birth and the creation of a human being and watching them become wonderful, amazing young adults is a powerful experience. And he was an amazing human being. He is an amazing human being. And so the idea of that, this life, this person that taught myself and many other people so many things, who completely influenced who I am today, completely is wrapped up in his life and his journey and who he is. The idea of that sort of disappearing off of the face of the earth terrifies me. And that's why, even though sometimes I will feel bad on because I'm always, I'm a guilt person, but posting pictures when they come up, or talking about it on his birthdays and on his anniversary that he passed. Sometimes I feel bad about that, because it's like, okay, people, I feel in my head, I'm like, people are like, okay, whatever, it's sad, but it's, but so a lot of that comes from that strong desire for people to remember him, people to know him, and that is because I think he's amazing, and so I don't want that to. And I know, I know the people that know him and things that he will not ever be forgotten. But that is one of my greatest fears. I found a article or post that I wrote. This was 6 months after he had passed, so it was a very early fear, and it continues to be one of those things that I have to work through. Well, I'm going to go ahead and read this. Stories are for joining the past to the future. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story. This is a quote from one of my favorite books by Tim O'Brien called The Things They Carried. I've always believed in the importance of stories and in the power of stories to sometimes hold more truth than the facts of truth, and that belief has only solidified. One of the most proud moments in my life was teaching both of my children to read. I was terrified that somehow, despite my love and addiction for the written word, I would fail in that most important task of teaching them to read, and they would be forever shut off from the world of stories. Thankfully, that did not happen, and I had the privilege of watching them both learn first to read and then to create their own stories. I was at my sister's 4th of July cookout the other week, watching the next little set of cousins that will be growing up together, as my niece and youngest sisters have their babies years and years apart from mine. I was already feeling a little emotional because Michael loved the 4th of July, especially loved the inevitable bonfires. He would coerce my mother into collecting all my niece's well-worn stuffed animals so he could sacrifice them to the flames. Then, while watching this new pack of little 2 to 4-year-olds, I realized that they would never know Michael. Not really. They would only know him from what people told them, not him. This devastated me because Michael loved it when a new little one came into the family, another little minion to teach his ways of Super Mario and drawing and stuffed animal hunts and sacrifices and other trickstery things. He had a gift with children. They loved him, and he so enjoyed spending time with them. As 6 months has passed, the grief is shifting and settling, and while maybe some days less sharp, it is more heavy, and when a bad day hits, even if there are 4 or 5 more good days, it hits like a locomotive. I have this building panic of him being forgotten. I know I have said this before, but it bears saying again because someone has to say it for all the other parents worried about the same thing. I will never see him again physically or hear his voice off of or apart from the computer. He's shifting for most people into memory, and memory fades. So what does that leave but story? I have this tick almost that I'm sure a psychologist would say that's a normal part of the healing process. But sometimes it annoys me even as I go through the rhythm of it, usually with my sister Sarah as the victim. Every month or so since he's died, I start to get a buildup of anxiety beyond the normal grief anxiety until I have to sit down with someone and go through the whole mess from Wednesday night when he was feeling so great to Thursday when he turned so fast and we took him to the hospital, to his death on Friday, and through to the funeral on Tuesday. Detail by detail what happened, who said what, who was where, what was going through my head, what the hell happened. I guess it's my story of how I got here, a mother whose son is dead. I think I still can't really fathom that the child I carried for 36 weeks in my stomach and then fought for 23 years is really dead. And I have to keep telling someone the story so that my brain can try to process what happened. Once upon a time, there was a boy and his name was Michael, and he had the bluest eyes. He whistled like his great-grandfather. He drew his life larger than his body would let it be, and he had the knack for catching the biggest frogs and the most fish. He loved animals of all kinds, but especially birds, and he surrounded himself with birds, both as pets and with feeders and baths outside his windows to watch. He grew up watching me game and became an avid gamer himself, conquering worlds, pushing back hordes, and super smashing his way through life despite his health. His chubby, round baby face gave way to elven angles, his body all edges with an always up-to-something smirk. He struggled to make peace with a body that restricted him, and he was given the grace and the sorrow of never growing up. There is the end to his story, and this breaks my heart. So I will keep writing his story, and his cousin Alyssa will keep drawing like he taught her. And his sister will keep saying, remember when Michael and I laid on the top bunk and watched movies through the window of the video store next door? And that way, we can hold off the end, and we will tell the next part of the Fitzgerald clan that once there was this amazing guy who would have loved to have met you. Breathing. Breathing. This was from 3.5 years ago. Breathing. Last night I dreamt I was in bed and little Michael, 3 or 4, chubby and inquisitive, was lying next to me chattering away. It was dark and there were shadows playing on the walls, and we were talking about the shadows. I could feel him, physically feel him, snuggled up against me, and then rolled over to babble about a dragon shadow, tugging the blankets and laughing. Once upon a time, there was a boy. So, excuse me, that was 6 months after his passing, and my fear was that he would be forgotten, and that is still my greatest fear today. And it doesn't matter if it's irrational. It doesn't matter that, of course, nobody in my family will ever forget him, and I know many, many people and who his life has touched that will never forget him. But that is my greatest fear, and it is still a very strong part of my grieving process. So that was that point. But the other question was, what is my greatest joy that I found in the process, or in the process of all of this? And that was that he is everywhere. For me, of course, he can never be forgotten because he's everywhere. I talk about his love of birds. For me, from day one, I remember the day after the funeral, this huge, enormous flock of birds. So I was standing in the apartment that I had was on the ground floor, and it had a big window to a backyard that was just kind of trees and things of that nature. And just huge. I've seen lots of flocks of birds, but this was just a huge flock of birds, just whoosh, black in the sky. But it was very dramatic. Black in the sky. I think I have pictures of it. And covered the ground, covered the trees, covered the ground, was just completely turned black from this flock of birds just swooshing in and landing right in front of me, standing in the window. And there will be no one and nothing that can ever convince me that was anything but a message from Michael saying it's going to be okay. Swooshed in, sat there, covered the ground, and swooshed out. And it was just, and ever since then, birds everywhere. Crazy little things with birds. Birds sitting above me on a rack in stores. Birds hopping along and following along the pathway when I'm walking down the street. Just story after story of bird incidences that have become oracles for me of Michael saying, hey there, yeah, bird. Just everywhere. In the blue skies will be a certain color blue, and it's instantly his eyes when he was a baby. Just funny little moments that just crop up. For one of the saddest things was, but for a year, maybe even 2 year, I would find just, those random things. And I've moved since he's passed away, so I'm not in the apartment obviously that he was in, but finding little things, finding random Pez, half a bag of Pez. He used to buy me bags of Pez candies because I loved the Pez candies, and so instead of buying the Pez's was just two like things of Pez candies, he would buy me a bag. He would go to the toy store. They would have apparently a bag full of those little refills for the Pez dispenser, and I doled those out for a long time. I found his wallet, and there was a gift card to Barnes and Nobles, and got a book from Michael, and just little things like that. Those kinds of things in which he's just always there. He's in everything. He's in all kinds of moments that will happen, and I'll think, oh, Michael would have thought this, or Michael would have thought that. He's everywhere. So the fear, on one hand, the greatest fear is him being forgotten, and on the other hand, the greatest joy is that he's everywhere. He's in everything that I do. So, good question, person. So, how do I bring this back around? In terms of the other question that I get asked a lot is, how do you support somebody who's grieving? And I've talked about this before, but I'm, trying to just kind of contain this into one space. But how do you support somebody who's grieving? I had really wonderful, I can do a whole video on what not to say to somebody who's grieving, because there's some wing dingers, but we'll try to keep this positive, right? I think the only thing to say to somebody is, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, and I'm here. And I think that ability to support someone without smothering them or trying to make their grief be more comfortable to you is key. That doesn't need to look the way that you feel that it should look, and it doesn't need to be look in a way in which you're going to become more comfortable. And so I just think there's nothing really to say. There's nothing to say that's going to help. There are many things to say that can be hurtful, and there's not a lot to say that can help other than I'm sorry. To me, that was always, and it remains the same thing. I'm so sorry. And if you need me, I'm here. That kind of being able to remind somebody that you're there without smothering them. And again, this is me. I don't like to be smothered. I need space. So everybody's different, right, and how they do it. But I think you can't go wrong with I'm sorry. And if you need anything, I am here. And continuing to be able to say that. Is really important. I had my dear friend, she knew me enough to know I don't need somebody there and hovering over me all the time. And so she would send me, once a month or so, or every couple of weeks in the beginning, she would send me a gift card to Amazon for a Kindle book, because for a while that's the only thing I could do was just read other things, not books on grieving, but just read. And so she just, she wouldn't make a big production out of it. I would just get an email with a Kindle or an Amazon thing for a Kindle book. And it was just a kind of a quiet, feeding me resources to buy books. So I think that was one of the key things, is know the person that you're trying to be supportive of, and through that knowledge of them, be the support that they need, because some people do need, right? I feel like I'm all whopper-jawed. Some people do need that really hands-on, and the hugs and the sitting in the space and, physically being there. Everybody's different. And that's the key thing, is everybody is different. And so know the person that you're trying to support, and tailor your support to that person. And also, again, in terms of what to say, if you don't know the person, just, I'm sorry. And if there's anything I can do, please let me know. I'm here. That's good enough to me. That's more than good enough. So there's another thing I wanted to read. This is the last thing, but I just love this. I don't even care if it's an urban legend. I found this, and that went around the internet for a while, and it could be a scam. It could not be something that happened. But the story goes that there was, somebody had left a post, and I can't even remember, that they had lost somebody. It was a very simple post that, I'd lost so and so and I missed them, or something like that. It was and in the response to that, and I think from the legend, so to speak, again, I don't know, and I don't care, to be honest, because I love what was said, that it doesn't really matter to me. The story goes, the post itself had disappeared. It really wasn't there. There was only the title, but then the comments were still there. And in the comments, an old man wrote this. And I just love it, because I think it's a really good description of grief. And so, yeah. Somebody's probably going to write me and say, oh, that's an urban legend. That was really written by so-and-so, but I don't care. So here's the comment. I'm old. What that means is that I've survived so far, and a lot of people I've known and loved did not. I've lost friends, best friends, acquaintances, co-workers, grandparents as mom, relatives, teachers, mentors, students, neighbors, and a host of other folks. I have no children, and I can't imagine the pain it must be to lose a child, but here's my 2 cents. I wish I could say that you get used to people dying, but I never did. I don't want to. It tears a hole through me whenever somebody I love dies, no matter the circumstances. But I don't want it to not matter. I don't want it to be something that just passes. My scars are a testament to the love and the relationship that I had for and with that person. And if the scar is deep, so was the love. So be it. Scars are a testament to life. Scars are a testament that I can love deeply and live deeply and be cut and even gouged, and that I can heal and continue to live and continue to love. And the scar tissue is stronger than the original flesh ever was. Scars are a testament to life. Scars are only ugly to people who can't see. As for grief, you'll find it comes in waves. When the ship is first wrecked, you're drowning, with wreckage all around you. Everything floating around you reminds you of the beauty and the magnificence of the ship that was and is no more. And all you can do is float. You may find pieces of the wreckage and you hang on for a while. Maybe it's some physical thing. Maybe it's a happy memory or a photograph. Maybe it's a person who is also floating. For a while, all you can do is float. Stay alive. In the beginning, the waves are 100 feet tall and crash over you without mercy. They come 10 seconds apart and don't even give you time to catch your breath. All you can do is hang on and float. And after a while, maybe weeks, maybe months, you'll find the waves are still 100 feet tall, but they come further apart. When they come, they still crash all over you and wipe you out. But in between, you can breathe. You can function. You never know what's going to trigger the grief. It might be a song, a picture, a street intersection, the smell of a cup of coffee. It can be just about anything, and the waves come crashing. But in between the waves, there is life. Somewhere down the line, and it's different for everybody, you find that the waves are only 80 feet tall or 50 feet tall. And while they still come, they come further apart. You can see them coming. An anniversary, a birthday, or Christmas, or landing at O'Hare. You can see it coming for the most part and prepare yourself. And when it washes over you, you know that somehow you will again come out the other side, soaking wet, sputtering, still hanging on to some tiny piece of the wreckage, but you'll come out. Take it from an old guy. The waves never stop coming, and somehow you don't really want them to. But you'll learn that you'll survive them, and other waves will come, and you'll survive them too. If you're lucky, you'll have a lot of scars from a lot of loves and a lot of shipwrecks. Whoever you are, Mr. Old Man, even if you're a fake old man, yes. So that is my experience, a lot of my experience with the grieving process as well, in terms of that going over time. For me, I feel like the waves are still 100 feet tall, but there is the space between. And of course, at first you start to feel guilty when there's the space between, but that's a whole nother conversation. But you do learn to see them coming. And I think that for me is really key, especially in the last year or so, the understanding of knowing when being able to see them coming, being able to feel them coming a little bit ahead of time is really helpful, because then you can actually plan. You can actually try to know that this is coming, get your support in place, remind yourself that you will come out the other side, remind yourself that, kind of set things in place and find what works for you, and be ready for it. And that's been my experience, certainly in the last year, is really knowing when things are going to happen and sort of setting those in place. But I did a painting, when I'm starting to try to work with acrylic paints and palette knives, and this is my a painting of grief, and those swells that are there, right? But there is that light. There are those moments where the waves are far apart and you do get the moonlight through, but I love the texture of acrylic paint. When you use a knife, it's like it's physical. It's very different than a watercolor painting. But for me, painting has so okay, what are the things how do I prepare for when I know a wave is coming? For me, it is creativity. Learning to paint has been an immensely powerful healing experience for me, because not only is it an expression of my creativity that helps in the healing process, but it's also a connection to my son, who drew and sketched and painted. And I didn't do a lot of painting. He more sculpted and sketched and colored, those types of things. But when I feel connected to him, I use his pencil. I have the last pencil that he was using. I use his eraser. I feel him over my shoulder being like, yes, Mom, go you. because I know that he's thrilled that I'm actually doing what I never thought I could ever do. And so painting has been healing. And so making sure that if I know it's coming, that I'm giving myself opportunity to create, to write, to paint, to draw, to do those things, creation and creativity, and being able to express that is a very powerful healing experience. Holding space. I have a space that is, for my son. I have a healing sacred space on a shelf that has his urn and has bits and bobs that are reflective of who he is. It has grown. My daughter has left little things, and my friends left little things. My mother has given me, birthday cards for him, and found space there. And having that space and candles. My mother kept me in. She's one of those who's good with that sort of quiet. I'm going to slip you a box of the plain white 7-day candles, because I went through those for probably 2 years. And she would just, slip me a box. She'd go to the dollar store and get a box of them and kind of, there you go, here's another box of candles, right? So being able to sit with and hold space and light candles are very important. You can see up here, my grandmother passed, and so I have a Mary statue and a rosary, and I have candles. I need to change that one out, but I have candles, and you can't see, but there's also a picture of Michael right there. And so being able to have a space to light candles in remembrance and things is very healing. And so that type of thing is very a healing outlet. Just being able to talk about him, to be honest, is extremely healing. Having those people that I can just casually, oh my gosh, Michael would have found this to be absolutely hilarious. I remember this story when XYZ, being able to have those conversations is so important, because again, he's so much of who I am. And so having people that hold space for that is very healing. So yeah, I think that is everything that I need to say about it. I don't know that accomplished what it was that I wanted to accomplish. But I just want to say, because there's so many people out there that I know personally are on a continually working with healing things, both fresh ones and older ones, and all different time periods, and all different stories, and all different nuances, and all different aspects to what that grief might be, and what might look like, and where they're at, and what they're trying to accomplish. And my heart goes out to every single one of you. If you have lost somebody, I am sorry. I am sorry, and I am here. And grief is an extremely lonely and isolating thing, but you aren't alone. And I hope that you are aware of that. I hope that you find the things that will help you breathe with the space between the waves, and just know that you are not alone, and that you can survive. When the wave hits, you can survive. You can come out the other side. And this world that you're in, that we find ourselves in, minus somebody, it looks very different, and it is a very different world, but you can find a space in it. You can find a way to live in this world that looks very different. And while we may wish it to not be so, it is what we have to live in, and there is a way to do that. And so I hope that you find support along the way. I hope that in some way this helps, even in the smallest of ways. And I wish you so much peace as you move forward.